Thank you, Bruce. So I'm glad to be here, talk to you. So 30 years ago, 20 years ago, the degree that you got, let's say you got a degree in mechanical engineering or electrical, was a predictor of what you are going to do. Engineers were thought in terms of what they made, MEs with cars, civils with bridges, biomeds with devices. But that stopped being true some time ago, although not in every place at the same time, certainly here, okay? A lot of you will go and do things which are in service sector jobs. Some of you may become VCs, venture capitalists, investing in companies that someone else creates. So the picture changed from engineer thought in terms of what they made to engineers thought in terms of how they think. And it's the thinking part what will remain with you no matter where you go and what you do, okay? Now, at a much higher level, I believe that this is true. That at the highest levels, there is very little difference in between have an artist, an engineer, and a scientist think. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about me, but a lot of what I did on the research side of things were things like this, and they are all connected with visual representations of chaotic systems. And somehow, I was able to connect research questions to visual images. And probably that was due to the fact that I was doing these things since I was maybe 15. And using visual imagination for research questions is something that helped me in my career. So, but in today's talk, I'll try to give you a sense of why is that the value of thinking using both sides of the brain is that the space for creative solutions is higher. So I'll try to make a case for why that's important. And then I'll talk something about art, technology, and science, and the value of these intersections. And many of you may have seen the video that we have about McCormick. And then I will give you some lessons coming from art. But I guess when you finish all the design sequence, and then you go in your own directions, you probably will see how these lessons, in retrospective, your own distillation, apply to design as well. Okay, so the first one is how to make sense of things. If everything was clear, our life will be much easier, but then there will be much less differentiation in between people who can anticipate the future and people who can follow what everybody else does. So an indication of how volatile the future is that if you start looking at who is in the top 10 positions in the Fortune 100, you will see a lot of volatility. Some companies have stayed there for a while, like Exxon, but some have followed by the wayside, and some that they were not even in anybody's imagination 10, 20 years ago, now are at the top, okay? But all companies start with an idea. So in this graph, what you have is how old something is and how big it becomes. So many things don't follow this curve. They start and then they die. They don't evolve from the creative idea. But they all start with a creative spark. And then as they become bigger and more complex, you may need different skills to run the place. So that's why people who are the founders of the company, they are not probably the people running the company long term. You just go and hire a CEO to do the job. And many of you may have seen the story of Steve Jobs and how he had to bring people from the outside. That's not the case with Zuckerberg yet, but eventually you're on top of the world one day, and I guarantee 10 years from now, the picture will look completely different, okay? So many people are in the business of trying to predict the future. The Economist, every year, this came up probably a few weeks ago, they try to tell you what they think will happen in 2014. And they are pretty honest. They tell you how they did in 2013. And usually the batting average, even though it's 1 year ahead, is about, I don't know, 50%. Now, initially we were going to do this talk at the beginning of the year, so starting with this is probably a good idea. This was an article compiled by someone who, in 1900, decided to consult the best minds of the time. I tried to make predictions on how the world was going to be in the year 2000. Okay? So some predictions, there are many of them, they are all explained in fine print in there. One prediction was that it's about demographics. Now, that one in 1900 you couldn't predict, but now you can predict exactly what the population of the US will be 10, 15 years from now. We'll know that Russia will diminish in population. We'll know that China, you cannot fix a demographic problem instantly except for with immigration. But if you had a one-child policy for 10 years, then you pay the consequence at some point. Another prediction was this one. This may sound really laughable, but 1/3 of all the harvest area in the US in the year 1900 was used for grow things to feed horses. And cars were barely in the horizon. And in fact, I may say something about this. So they were right on this one. This one that the letters, which ones are? C, X, and Q. X and Q, I can see why the letter C was going to disappear from the English language. I have no idea, but that was a prediction. And that's kind of off the mark. He was predicting that Russian will be the most popular language after English. But another prediction was this. This was way, way at the beginning of electricity. Movie theaters were kind of barely developed. But this prediction was that they will be possible to see in screens, such as this one, with cables connecting thousands of miles away. They went to say, you will see wars occurring in the Orient, he said, or coronations of kings. That's basically what we have now in different ways when you open your laptops. But another way of making predictions and the speed at which things happen is this one. So this is the number of years that it took for several technologies to penetrate half of the market. Okay? And you will see telephones took 70 years, radios 28, and it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And what I can more or less tell you is that there is something that we do not know about that is taking place now that will peak before you finish in here. Okay? If I knew what that was, I will be investing on that, okay? But things happen very, very quickly. And one of the problems of every generation is that somehow you have everything figured out. And then something displaces you in the same way that the people who were in the middle of railroading, and Chicago was in the middle of all of that, by the way, the name Murphy, which is the person who founded the whole institute in here, was one of these railroad tycoons. They never thought that planes were going to compete with railroads for transportation of people. And they were not in the business of transportation, they were in the business of railroading, and that was the wrong framework to have. So I promise that I will talk about art, technology, and science. And one thing that goes with these words, or one of the possibilities that goes with these words, is that art goes with creation, although I will talk more about that. Technology, at least at the level of large organizations, goes with organizations, and science goes with knowledge. Now, the first part that you need to demystify, and there are like a million different ways of demystifying this, is that creation depends on somehow you being bestowed with a ray of inspiration and somehow everything happens. So one prime example, there are tons of them, is this book, which I hope many of you will recognize from your high school days, okay? The myth is that this book was written in one sitting. Jack Kerouac didn't bother to change sheets in the typewriter. It was one long burst of inspiration that led to the whole thing. The people who have researched this know that this is not true, but connecting inspiration and art with creativity is a myth embedded in the popular culture. And what I'm here to tell you is that there's as much creativity in engineering and technology and science as there is in the art side of things. However, what I want to mention is that those three words, creation, knowledge, and organization, or that go with science, knowledge, they go in parallel to the growth of organization. So if you want to be in something that goes from the beginning to the end, you better have the skills that will prepare you to traverse these three domains. You may be very creative, but not being someone who has organizational skills, who cannot handle many components. So I want to equate that having a broad-based education will prepare you to go through the whole sequence in there. So why is this important? There are lots of things that make the world now fairly complicated, but is that the boundaries between things are disappearing, and I'm not going to go through all of those, that teams are becoming necessary because the problems that we face are bigger and bigger, and somehow everything is depending on speed, connectedness. Many years ago, information was scarce and information was power, but now information is everywhere. In fact, there is too much of it. The question is how to distill it. And adaptability is something that is hugely important. So I'll mention one example of the consequences of connectedness, okay? And how the ways of thinking about the world sometimes don't work, the conventional ways. So I'll mention this, and this has to do with fishing in the North Atlantic, okay? So there are quotas for how much you can catch of different fish, and it happened some time ago that the population of cod was diminishing, and so people were allowed to catch less and less, but media being what it is, they wanted to find a clean reason for why the population of cod was diminishing. And they argue that the population of harp seals had gotten out of whack, and that was the reason for the diminishing numbers of cod. So one thing that you will learn in engineering is to think in terms of systems and quick sketches of things. So one way to think about this is that the cod eats, let's say, crustaceans, who are at the bottom of the food chain, and that the cods are in turn eaten by the harp seals. Or if you want to be a little bit more sophisticated, you can say that there are several things of kinds of crustaceans that are eaten by cod. However, if you look at all the species that live, by the way, this will be any ecosystem will have that you can think of will have the same degree of complexity. What you see there are the number of species, and the arrows connecting one species to another one is who eats what. And if you have an arrow going back, means cannibalism, that species eats some of their own. But if you look at that diagram and you try to predict what will happen if you tweak with one piece, it's kind of pointless. So that I'm using as an example of a system that is complex. However, most of what we think in conventional initial courses, because you have to learn to walk before you can run, are systems kind of on the left in there, which would call simple systems, okay? The systems in there have the basic elements that you need to bring in to understand complex systems, but they are building blocks. And then you have systems in the middle there, the systems that I call complicated, that have lots and lots and lots of parts, but in each of those parts, you have the ability to design what function each of the parts takes. So when you build an airplane, like 777X or whatever it is, which, by the way, is the project of that plane is the biggest plane that now Boeing is building. It's $9 billion in orders. It's one of our alarms, okay? If something breaks, you better have a backup because the plane doesn't adapt to function in another way. Whereas the systems on the far right, systems that are complex, there is an adaptation mechanism. Those systems are complex. So the lesson in here is that there are many systems in which if you know how each of the parts behave, you cannot predict the consequences. And systems, so the answer to this question is no. And there are many systems that even if you know the outcome and you can deduce what were the root reasons for that outcome, like in the school of fish that I mentioned, I had in there, the answer is still no. So the reason that the world is complicated is that in many cases we have plans and reality and there is a gap, and it's impossible to predict the consequences of that gap, okay? So this brings me to the word complexity, and some time ago, every 4 or 5 years, IBM does a report. They survey the landscape of CEOs, and they ask, what is the number one issue that preoccupies you? And the number one issue was complexity in that year. This is 4 years ago. But the number one attribute that people had to have to work in that complex world that people were seen as challenging was creativity, which is at the top of that list. So I'll say something about this, creativity. And the first one is this right brain, left brain metaphor. The brain is much more complicated to be reduced to something like this. This is a way to think about the issue, not something that if you take a course in neuroscience, people will tell you that this is true, okay? So you have a left brain function, which is the analytical side. So everybody who comes into engineering is well equipped on that side. And then you have a right brain side that is the analytical part, the more metaphorical thinking, divergent thinking. So I'll give you one example about these two functions. And the example has to do with people who, unfortunately, for one reason or another one, have had complete damage of one hemisphere of the brain. So to people who have had a complete shutdown of one hemisphere, you show them an input, and in this case the input is one figure, and you ask them to tell you what is that they have seen. So the people who have only the left brain active, okay, the analytical side, when they see that image, they tell you that they have seen this. It's all details. Whereas the people who have only the right brain active, they will tell you that they see this. Okay? So this is something to keep in mind, is one example that I hope hones on the idea of why you need both sides. In one case you see details, and the other, and details can be hugely important in some problems. In some problems, understanding the big picture is also super important, but you have to work at both. So I'll tell you now about this. And if you have to put a verb, and implicitly we did this before, if you have to put a verb behind art, technology, and science, in art is creation, in technology is invention, and in science is discovery. And one thing that the whole point of the talk is that design sort of expands some of these areas. And on this side, you have the left brain kind of skills, and in there, the right brain kind of skills. So one of the reasons, and I mentioned this when I gave the example of Kerouac about creativity, you see the finished book and somehow the story on how the book was written in that continuous roll of paper appears. You attribute that to pure inspiration. But I like this quote from Albert Einstein, and is that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant, okay? So the analytical skills, which he talks about, the rational mind, is something that it's at your you operate at your will. You decide when you want to deploy those skills. The other part is not, if not a gift, it can be learned, and that's the whole point of when we're doing this. You have to have that part as sometimes the guide to the rational mind, okay? So the point is this, and this is probably the next two slides are crucial to the argument that we want to make, is that analytical tools, and when you finish in here, you will have a whole bag of analytical tools, okay? It depends a little bit on what you do. So if you do computer science, you'll have slightly different tools that if you do industrial engineering, but you'll have tools, and these tools are great to solve problems. That's why all of you will have many multiple offers, because those skills, remember, engineers should be thought in terms of how they think. That's why people would want to hire you. However, there is a danger in having a whole box of analytical tools, even if you are amazingly good with it, okay? The danger is that there is no big prize for solving correctly what turns out to be the wrong problem. Now, this may not sound really profound to you, but when you start in design, the main point of design is that no matter how simplistic the issue may be, is that you spend a lot of time finding what the question is. So finding the right question is essential. Whereas in many other courses that you will take, homeworks, those problems have a clear question and your job is to find the answer. But in real life, it's important to be able to do both, okay? Finding the question, if you are completely set up, finding questions is an important thing. You could hire people to help you find the answers. But the world is full of failures of people who solve correctly, and I'm not talking about something like a homework, I'm talking something bigger, something that turned out to be the wrong question. So I'll give you a little bit about these three domains, okay? And we can talk about a whole bunch of things, okay? For example, how people go into these domains. There is still the possibility in art that you could become a great artist without having had formal training. There is no way on earth to be a good scientist now without having had formal training. Technology is kind of in between. Look at a guy like Jobs, he didn't have really any degree, so it's proved by actually doing things. So we compare a few things in here. So how old are they? Art is as old as humanity itself. Technology, by the time that you did one of these, you are not doing technology. By the time that you are doing 2 or 3, you are doing technology. And I mean, these are Roman aqueducts and the Pantheon in Rome. I mean, these were done before the laws of statics were discovered. So there was engineering and technology before there was science. And science is kind of more of a baby at the length and time scales that we're talking about. Maybe 500 years ago, if you connected with Galileo and dropping the things from the Tower of Pisa, or maybe 350 with the birth of the Royal Society. Now, the way that things grow is kind of interesting. In science, if something doesn't work, people don't keep hammering at it, okay? Eventually, everything that in every book that you have is the distillation of things that have worked. Once in a while, there is a revolution, like, I don't know, the Newtonian revolution, the quantum mechanics revolution, in biology, the Darwinian evolution, or the sequencing of DNA or something like that. But science goes methodically upwards. Technology, it kind of, you don't wait for one technology to have run its course before another one tries to supplant it. And art, there is no essential benefit in repeating what someone else has done and trying to do it better. It's always the challenge of the new that dominates the thing. So it's the most, in some sense, entrepreneurial or chaotic, and this will make it clear. All of these paintings were done in between maybe 1890, 1950, but unless you have taken a course in history of art, if I was asking you, put them in the sequence of the timeline that they were created, there's no way that you can do this, okay? In fact, these two that look completely different, this one looks like a photograph, and that one, they were created by the same person. And when there's something that depends more on design, I mean, every architect of note tried to design a chair. Again, there may be some difference in materials, but it's very hard to put them in the right chronological order because it's something completely dominated by design component rather than technological component. More in here. However, in technology, if you are coming from outer space, and I tell you there are several ways to produce light, and I show you something that produced with a candle, and the second one is whale oil. I mean, there was a time in the US in which most of the light came from whale oil. And light bulbs of different kinds, finishing with an LED. If you ask intelligent questions, there is no way that you could not put those in the right order. Technology is harder. So there was a time in which it was almost a toss-up as to which one of these modes of cars propulsion will dominate. There were electric cars. It's not a new invention. I mean, this is one example, big batteries. There were combustion cars, which is what we have now, and there were steam cars. And what dominated depends a lot on a whole bunch of conditions that do not have to be with which one is marginally the best technology. It depends on the environment, time, tie-ins with other things, okay? Now, why is that you can get by being here? And I'll try to make the point clear in two ways here in the next slide. You are here in a university where people are advancing the frontiers of knowledge. You will be busy taking courses, but if you look at the web or screens in every hallway, you see talks happening everywhere, okay? So if you are one of those VCs who is investing in the hot new thing, what you do sometimes is walk the hallways of a good university and you get ideas for what's the next thing, okay? And in every topic, at any given time, there is a frontier of knowledge that, let's say, stops here. But if you are surrounded by people, the best minds, who are all at that frontier, but slightly different, you have a possibility of advancing the field. And that's how a new idea comes into being. And the new idea could be an extension, could be a little extension, or could be a big extension in which is a breakthrough. But sometimes a breakthrough is kind of a suitable word because you have to break through the boundaries of that domain. You have to expand it and break. Sometimes the breakthrough is a break with, because in order for the new idea to be accepted, you have to abandon another idea. And lots of people have invested money and time in that other idea, and that's not easy to do, abandoning an idea. So there are two things that you will get here. One is increasing the chances of finding new things, okay? So for that, you have to scan the horizon and look what's going on. Some of you may be involved in research, okay? That's how new things happen, by pushing the envelope. And the other one is augmenting the way that we think. And that's the whole point about the right brain, left brain education. So I'll give you a few lessons, which once you are done with courses and you take the design components that make all of you equal at this moment, and then you bifurcate, you will tell me if these were on the mark or not. So I'll give you a few. So I have in here several ideas for what eventually became this painting that is in Leningrad by Matisse. But Matisse, when he showed up to paint, sometimes he was out of ideas and he painted the painting. Okay? So you see sketches of the painting he was done with that painting, but he showed up, painted, and he painted the painting. So the lesson in here is inspiration is overrated, okay? You don't go and paint when you are particularly inspired. You go, show up, and paint every day. Now, anybody who is in art will tell you this. From the outside, we don't think it in this way. But in the same way that artists will fantasize and romanticize how science works. You will think that one day you show up in the lab and it's the day that you make a fantastic discovery, but if you work in a lab, you'll discover that you have to put hour after hour working on this. So, second lesson. This is Picasso at 15, very classical. This is maybe Picasso at 17, about 22. This is when he was 40. So you see an evolution. And here you see a more drastic evolution. This is Kazimir Malevich. He was responsible for Russian suprematist, was the kind of school that he created. He started like this, then this. I'm skipping lots of points in his life, but then I don't think you can get more convergent than this. This is another one, and he got there. Actually, there are some paintings that are white over white. You basically have to be, a couple of inches away to see a difference, but this is the evolution of Malevich. But the lesson in here is, in all cases, you start with a solid grounding, but if you want to do something new, you have to learn a craft and then set it aside. Because if you don't do that, you will always continue in the same way that you started, okay? Now, to make the point clear on how much perspiration there goes into art, I want to mention this. There are a few painters that became famous with only a few paintings. Leonardo da Vinci is one, but he was very busy doing other things in his lifetime. Vermeer, who there's a show now in New York, is about 36. He's an exception. Rembrandt has 600. He had like a factory of paintings. He had assistants. And Van Gogh, who many of you know died tragically, he did 900 paintings in the last 2.5 years of his life. But Picasso, if you look at his total production, did one painting every 2.2 days. And he kept doing this for about 70 years. Andy Warhol, even more, but he had a shorter career. So the lesson is, start with a solid grounding and equate creation with hard work. Now, about the inspiration part, I like this quote, and a lot of this you'll see applied to design, is do something and then do something to it. Okay? Or the quote there about if you don't find the inspiration, go around the block once, maybe twice, and that's it. Okay? So the lesson here is you should take time to reflect, but within bounds. Don't have to take a whole sabbatical to think about something, unless you are very lucky and you can afford to do that. But do not wait for divine inspiration. This is the other lesson. This is a sculpture, is in New York, is Picasso, it's called Baboon and Young. It's all done with objects that Picasso found discarded in his home. If you look at it more closely, you'll see that the head, there were two toy cars kind of put together like this. So the lesson here is that there are things that form a whole that are composed of pieces, but the pieces, one integrating the whole, the entire whole, they lose identity and form part of this new thing. So the lesson is how to adapt and adopt, and bad artists copy, great artists steal. By copying is trying to do in the same way the totality of what someone else has done. The steal part, as I interpret what Picasso tried to say, is you pick a component and becomes part of a larger whole. You must have heard that there's no new technology in an iPhone. It's all old technology, except that it's integrating what constitutes a new, once you have it, once it appeared for the first time, it was just a new thing because how it was designed. I do not know if you recognize this house is one of the most famous houses that Frank Lloyd Wright did. It's in Pennsylvania. It's beautiful. There's a cascade kind of falling through the middle of the house. It was not that Frank Lloyd Wright had the idea of, I'm going to do a house with a kind of little river and a cascade just emerging from underneath the house. It was that someone said, I have this lot, and I want to build a house here. So the important thing is to learn how to thrive with constraints. And I love this. The absence of limitations or the absence of constraints is the enemy of art. You have to have constraints. Constraints inspire creativity. Without constraints, you produce things that are second rate. This is Kandinsky, another Kandinsky. And if I start showing you more Kandinskys, and you show up in a museum, I guarantee you'll recognize a Kandinsky, okay? So the lesson is, just because you have done something successful, don't repeat it forever. That's how things end. At some point, people say, enough of this, we have had enough. And this applies to intellectual production or even companies and products. This is a little bit too extreme on the repeat yourself, but this fellow, Rauschenberg, when he won the first prize in Venice, he phoned his dealer in New York and asked him to destroy everything that he had done so far because he didn't want to repeat anything that he had done before. So that's a little bit too extreme, but it has to do with being conscious of repetition. The other one, which is one of the most important lessons in my view, is this one. So Picasso did this painting, and eventually someone who was visiting him discovered that he had actually had something else in mind before, and Picasso described what he had in mind before. It was that he was painting lots of things having to do with babies. He had had a baby recently. So he had in mind a man who was holding a fish. The ocean is behind there, and the baby was trying to touch the fish. But when he finished, he went, looked at the thing from afar, and metaphorically, this is a good one. Finish a painting, you always have to move afar, look it with squinting eyes, sometimes put it in front of a mirror just to see it flip, how it looks, to see all the faults, and decided that that's not what he wanted to do. So he painted over, he chopped the piece, and that's the other piece that he had. So when you finish something, especially if there were many voices involved, be a piece of writing or a design project or anything, and God forbid that is done by committee because there are lots of voices, all of you should step back and see if this is what you wanted. So the lesson that I mentioned before about there is no big prize for solving correctly the incorrect problem is a problem of converging too quickly to what you think you will want to do and not being very critical with yourself at the end. So step back and look at the entire picture is the lesson in here. So let me just finish with my favorite lesson of all, and it's this one. Okay, so that went quickly. And again, this was Picasso. And you probably saw that the bull started with a few lines and then eventually became this. But the whole sequence went too fast for you to have noticed the dates. But if you notice the dates, you will see that this is in fact the first. And this is the last. Okay? So the lesson here is, and this is hard, you have to be able to see when there's something complicated, the elements that make it the way it is. They see the simplicity and complexity, but sometimes it's also important to see an idea and see the ramifications the idea would have had. I can guarantee that, for example, when the first sequencing of DNA, the first uncovering that DNA was composed of the double helix, was uncovered by Watson and Crick, they didn't imagine all the consequences that will have in the order of biotech and things like that. So I show you how science works, how technology works, and how art works. And now art is about the continual breaking of paradigms. And what I want to finish with is with this. Many of you may have heard this phrase of standing on the shoulders of giants. Isaac Newton said this. I did what I was able to do because I was standing on the shoulders of giants. So in science built on you using all previous work as the stepping stone to move forward, okay? In science, that's a good strategy. In technology, the only reason to stand on the shoulders of someone is to try to crush it. So if you come with one new technology, it's because you want to displace another technology, or maybe many other ones. And in art, it's really a bad idea to stand on the shoulders of anybody. So what in distillation here you have to do is that sometimes from many, many, many ideas, you want to reduce the essence of the idea, and then from that idea to see the consequences, okay? So this is the simplicity in complexity and complexity in simplicity. And hopefully in here, you will learn to do both. So let me just finish in here with this. Hopefully all of you will be in this category. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and the optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. So what eventually our goal for you is that if you see this, you will not see this, but rather you'll see this. Thank you.